Forget everything the mainstream media is about to tell you about what just happened around Bakhmut in the last 96 hours. Because what Ukrainian forces just executed, and I mean just executed, is not simply another tactical maneuver in a long war of attrition. What happened between Tuesday evening and Saturday morning is a strategic inflection point. And by the time I'm done walking you through this, you're going to understand exactly why this single operation may have rewritten the entire Eastern Front calculus. 3 supply routes severed. The TO 504 highway from Kostyantynivka, the secondary asphalt corridor running south from Chasiv Yar, and the unpaved logistics track that Russian forces had been using through the broken country east of Ivanivske. All 3, inside 96 hours. And the encirclement that closed at roughly 4:13 Saturday morning local time is not partial. It is not contested. It is not a temporary disruption pending Russian counteraction. As of right now, somewhere between 11,000 and 14,000 Russian troops, including elements of the 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade and what's left of the Wagner-derived formations operating in that sector, are operating inside a sealed pocket with no functioning ground line of communication to their rear. I want you to sit with that for a moment because I've spent decades watching military operations, and I've analyzed encirclements going back to the Cold War. What Ukrainian forces just executed is not the work of a degraded army throwing units at a map and hoping something sticks. This was deliberate. This was sequenced. This was, in my professional judgment, the most operationally sophisticated maneuver Ukraine has executed in this entire conflict. And the speed of it, 96 hours from initial breakthrough at Klishchiivka to closure of the pocket north of Soledar, tells you something very specific about what was actually happening on the Russian side of that line. Because you cannot encircle a competent, well-supplied, well-led force in 96 hours. You can only encircle a force that has been hollowed out from within. Let me explain what made this possible, because the Western press is going to focus on Ukrainian heroics and miss the actual story. The decisive capability here was not Western armor. It was not F-16s. It was the integration of HIMARS delivered precision fires against Russian command nodes and ammunition transfer points in the 72 hours preceding the ground maneuver, combined with extensive use of FPV drone swarms operating in the 8 to 14 kilometer band behind the Russian forward edge. That second piece is what most analysts are going to miss entirely. For those of you who didn't spend years studying Soviet and Russian operational doctrine, let me translate. Russian forces in that sector were dependent on what the General Staff calls echeloned logistics. Forward positions are supplied from regimental trains. Regimental trains are supplied from divisional dumps, and divisional dumps are fed from operational level depots further to the rear. That entire architecture depends on uninterrupted movement along a small number of road axes. Take out the trucks moving between echelons, and the forward positions go dry within 36 to 48 hours, regardless of how much ammunition is sitting in the rear. And that is exactly what Ukrainian drone operators did in the 72-hour window before the ground forces moved. They didn't try to destroy the depots. They destroyed the movement between the depots. And by the time the breakthrough hit at Klishchiivka, Russian forward battalions were already fighting with roughly a third of their normal combat load. Now here's where the analysis gets critical, and I want you to stay with me, because this is the part that virtually no one in the legacy commentary space is going to walk you through properly. Ukrainian forces did not strike one logistics axis. They struck 3 specific categories of supply infrastructure simultaneously, and they did it in a sequence that compounds. First, the T0504. That's the paved primary route, the one that handled fuel trucks, the heavy ammunition lifts, and rotational personnel movement. That went down Tuesday night when Ukrainian mechanized elements pushed through what had been considered a stable Russian defensive position west of Ivanivska. Second, the Chasiv Yar secondary corridor. That handled what the Russians euphemistically call medical evacuation, but which in practice has also been their wounded personnel withdrawal route and their casualty replacement insertion route. That went down Thursday afternoon. Third, and this is the one that closed the trap, the unpaved track running through the wooded country southeast of the main pocket. That was the route Russian commanders had been keeping in reserve precisely for the contingency of having to break out. Ukrainian airborne assault elements, supported by extensive mine laying along the cross-country alternatives, took that route Saturday morning at roughly 4:13. That is not a coincidence of timing. That is a targeting package built around a specific operational objective, not to inconvenience Russian logistics, but to seal the pocket on a timeline that denied Russian command the ability to react. And here's why that matters. You can sustain forces inside a contested pocket if you can run logistics convoys at night under drone cover. You can run a fighting withdrawal if you have a single intact axis to retreat along. What you cannot do under any circumstances, with any improvisation, with any quantity of helicopter resupply that the Russian aerospace forces can realistically generate in that threat environment, is sustain 12 to 14,000 troops inside a sealed pocket against an opponent who controls every axis of approach. The encirclement is what closed the operation. The sequencing is what guarantees it cannot be reversed by any action Russian command can take in the next several days. But if you thought the operational picture was alarming for the Russian side, stay with me, because the timing of the final closure reveals something even more significant. That 4:13 Saturday morning timestamp was not random. Having spent years studying military operations, I can tell you the timing of a decisive maneuver is often as strategically important as the maneuver itself. At 4:13 in the morning, on the Russian side of that line, you have shift changes happening at battalion command posts. You have the night shift staff officers handing off to the day shift staff officers. You have communications personnel rotating. You have the lowest tempo of decision-making activity at any point in the 24-hour cycle. Ukrainian airborne units understood that. They timed the final closure to hit precisely at the moment when the Russian command and control architecture was least capable of generating a coherent response. By the time senior Russian commanders in the rear were briefed and in a position to authorize counteraction, the trap was already closed, and the surviving Russian elements inside the pocket had already begun the fragmented, uncoordinated, formation-by-formation collapse that I want to talk about now. I want you to understand what this does to a fighting force, because I've watched this dynamic play out before and the pattern is consistent. Soldiers in a defensive position can endure extraordinary conditions, sustained shelling, casualty rates that would have broken Western armies, deprivation, cold, exhaustion. They can absorb all of it as long as they believe two things. They believe their leadership knows what it's doing, and they believe there is a path back to friendly lines. The moment those two beliefs fail, what looked like an army yesterday becomes something categorically different today. It becomes individuals making individual decisions about individual survival. And no command structure on Earth can put that back together inside a sealed pocket on a 96-hour timeline. The Russian formations inside the Bakhmut pocket lost both of those beliefs Saturday morning. They lost confidence in command when the third axis closed and no relief order came. And they lost the path home when they realized the pocket was not a temporary embarrassment to be relieved by Wednesday, but a strategic catastrophe that nobody in Moscow had a plan for. The psychological collapse that follows that realization is not something that will appear in official Russian statements, but it is arguably the most consequential effect of this entire operation. You think you've heard the worst of it. You haven't. Not even close. Because the closure of the Bakhmut pocket is simultaneously detonating four separate crises across the broader Russian operational picture. And the convergence of those crises is what makes this moment categorically different from anything we've seen on the Eastern Front. Crisis number one. The forces in the pocket include what was, until Saturday morning, the operational reserve for the entire Donetsk axis. Russian command was holding those formations precisely because they were supposed to be the counterattack force if Ukrainian operations elsewhere on the line achieved breakthrough. That reserve is now combat ineffective. Crisis number two. The artillery ammunition stockpiles inside the pocket, accumulated over months for what Russian command had planned as a summer offensive push toward Klishchiivka, are now either captured or about to be. Crisis number three. The command and signals infrastructure inside the pocket included two divisional level command posts. The senior officers in those command posts are now either dead, captured, or attempting to walk out cross-country, and either way they are not commanding anything. Crisis number 4. The flank Russian formations to the north and south of the pocket, the ones that were anchoring the broader defensive line, are now exposed on the inner shoulder of a void where 12,000 troops used to be. Those flanks are going to have to be pulled back, and pulling them back means abandoning positions Russian forces spent over a year and an unknown number of dead taking. Russian command has been managing problems on the Eastern Front sequentially for the better part of 2 years. Manpower shortfalls, then ammunition rationing, then drone attrition, then officer casualties. They handled each one in turn, often badly, but in turn. What happened at 4:13 Saturday morning forces them to handle all of it at once, on a timeline measured in days, with a reserve that no longer exists, on a line that is now structurally indefensible in its current configuration. The reality is that Bakhmut was not really about Bakhmut. The city itself, the rubble pile that consumed 2 years of Russian offensive effort and somewhere north of 60,000 Russian casualties, depending on whose accounting you trust, was always strategically marginal. What the encirclement did was not liberate Bakhmut. What it did was demonstrate to Kyiv, to Washington, to every European capital that has been wavering on continued support, and to Moscow itself, that Russian defensive positions on the Eastern Front are not the impregnable meat grinder they have been advertised to be. They are hollow. They depend on logistics architectures that can be unwound in 72 hours by an opponent willing to integrate precision fires, drone warfare, and combined arms maneuver in exactly the right sequence. And they are defended by formations whose cohesion does not survive contact with sealed encirclement. 3 supply routes, 1 pocket, 12 to 14,000 troops, 96 hours. That is not a tactical victory. That is a strategic threshold being crossed in real time. And the decisions being made in Moscow this weekend, by people I can tell you from experience are operating on very little sleep and even less reliable information from the front, will define the next phase of this war in ways that the decisions of the previous 12 months have not. At what point does a command structure facing this precise convergence have to stop pretending the line can be held in its current configuration and start making existential choices about where the next line gets drawn? That is the question being asked behind closed doors in Moscow right now. The pocket is sealed. The reserve is gone. The flanks are exposed. And the smoke rising over the wood lines south of Chasiv Yar in the early light of a Saturday morning marks the location where the most strategically significant single operation of this entire war just rewrote the rules of everything that comes next.